7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
You'll never have the sacred stone.
Oh, this you crazy mother...
Welcome everybody to today's episode of DPS Radio. It's Thursday, February 7th. Really happy to see all of the live listeners today. This is the, fourth or fifth week we've done DPS Radio. I've lost count already. And we're looking to grow our live pool of listeners, get some good conversation back and forth, give the listeners a chance to ask some questions and have that kind of live dynamic feel. Joining us on the episode this week is veteran journalist. Is it okay if I call you a veteran? You're such a young guy. Veteran journalist, Zaid Jilani. Thanks so much for joining us, Zaid.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
So you've done a lot of work in your relatively short lifespan. How old a guy are you, by the way?
Well, I am 30 now, which to me feels like a foot in the grave. Because I started doing this when I was around 21, I would say. So, yeah, it feels like a decent clip, definitely.
Jesus, Zaid, you're one of those guys who makes people like me, who's kind of a late bloomer in life, to put it lightly. I drank away most of my early 20s and late teens. You're the kind of guy that makes us feel bad about ourselves, that we just didn't accomplish enough before we turned 30. You and Karl Marx, I think.
Well, I don't usually get the comparison, but that's pretty. I think that's pretty good. I think he's pretty influential, right? So
yeah, just don't burn out early. We need you. We need a nice long career out of you, because I think you do important work. But you, not unlike DPS, have a somewhat idiosyncratic interpretation of your political perspectives and the way that you bring an analytic lens to bear on the topics that you write about. And so I think you're a perfect sparring partner here for today's topic, which is countering the liberal zeitgeist from the left. And that's to say that I think what we try to do here on Dead Pundits is counter this kind of liberal culture war that, by the way, it might come from the liberals, but it doesn't benefit the liberals. It benefits the right. That's the terrain of the conservatives, unfortunately. But how do we get beyond this from a principled left perspective? So let's start there. You had a notable appearance on Tucker Carlson's show earlier this week, where you spoke about that very topic. You've gotten quite a bit of heat for that. I think that people have a very short-term memory when they think about guests on Tucker Carlson. Many heroes of the left have appeared on Tucker Carlson's very show. And since Angela Nagel showed up a couple of months ago, people seem to have conveniently forgotten about that. So tell us about your experience on Tucker Carlson and the kind of arguments you made there and why you decided to go on to make them.
yeah. So actually, my first boss out of college, over at the Center for American Progress, which is this Democratic-aligned think tank, was Faz Shakir. He ran Think Progress, which was the blog they ran. And he actually was on Tucker Carlson's show, I'd say a few months ago. He's now the head of the ACLU's Washington office. And so I guess it was a natural rite of passage. Faz was on the show, so it was my turn next. But I think, it's interesting what you were saying in terms of, I think that there's definitely more so than when I first started in politics. There's more so now of just people segregating themselves into tribes and thinking, well, I can't really talk to that other tribe, and I'm not really secure enough about my beliefs to where if I do talk to that other tribe, maybe I won't be able to defend my point of view. But with me, it was very different. I remember when I was in college, I wrote a column trashing Neil Bortz, who's a very, very right-wing radio host in Georgia. And this was about the time he came to UGA. He spoke at UGA, and he spent the whole time bashing me and then talking like crap about me on his radio show. Like, friends and family were all like, wow, Zed, you're famous now. This guy just hates you. But that was kind of my political, that was my political kind of fire, the fire I was born into, which is that I like going and talking to other people, debating with them. I don't really try. The only people that I think I would try to avoid were probably people who would just not treat me fairly, would misrepresent me, maybe cut me off. But if I feel like they're at least gonna engage with what I'm saying, and take me seriously, and I'll take them seriously, then I feel like it can be a good conversation. I think that's kind of the case with Carlson. Like, I feel if I went on a show like Sean Hannity or Laura Ingraham, there's a much greater chance that they would maybe yell over me or just to kind of not treat the topic with the level of gravitas that it needs. But I think Carlson generally does do that on his show. As you mentioned, a number of other left wingers have gone in there, including my former boss Faz, and so I felt pretty comfortable about going on for that reason. In terms of what I was talking about, so basically, I'm sure everybody knows now because it's been national news. Last week, it was uncovered by a right-wing website that my incumbent governor, because I'm a Virginia resident, Ralph Northam, had in his medical school yearbook what appears to be a very offensive photograph. It has a gentleman in blackface and someone else in a Ku Klux Klan outfit.
Mm-hmm.
It's not clear whether he was in the photo or not. At first, he seemed to kind of say he was, but now he's saying he wasn't. Nevertheless, it was on his yearbook page, and so apparently he probably curated his yearbook page. I mean, we don't know the full story behind this,
Right.
But basically he came out very quickly and apologized for that. Said, "Man, that is really offensive photograph, but that's not who I am now." And I kind of took that as probably what he needed to do. I mean, he needed to apologize. A lot of people are insulted by it for obvious reasons, but I didn't really think he needed to resign. I thought that something that happened 35 years ago, someone did something tasteless, it was symbolic, can cause emotional distress or discomfort, but that's why you apologize. And I felt like that's what he did. And what was really interesting is Fox News had been running this campaign for like a week, or around that, or maybe not quite a week by the time maybe 3 or 4 days by the time I went on there, basically saying, we found out the Democrats are racist. They're terrible. Northam's got to go. All these Democrats have got to go. And Carlson actually took the time to hear my argument out, and I think I persuaded him. He seemed, I still think he's probably not a huge fan of Northam, probably more so for the comments about abortion that he made earlier that week.
Yeah, that was why he was targeted. He was targeted because he was supporting late-term abortions in a state like Virginia, and therefore,
the right-wing reporter who broke the story, Patrick Halley, who I sort of know, I've talked to him in the past, he said that basically there was someone who was upset, or I think someone on his website told the media that there was somebody who was a classmate of Northam's in medical school who was upset by some of the comments Northam had made about abortion, and that's why he went to Patrick Halley and showed him the photograph. So really, it's very interesting, and that the lineage of this actually stretches back to that, and that's why this kind of issue was weaponized as kind of a way to take out Northam. And it seems like, I'm sure we'll get into this, but it seems like the further two Democrats down the chain, Lieutenant Governor Fairfax, Attorney General Mark Herring, have also run into issues. And honestly, if all three of them step down, you get a Republican government in Virginia, because the Speaker of the House is the next person on the chain, is kind of the designated survivor of all these scandals. And so it's no surprise to me that Republicans are calling for all these people to step down. It would give them power. It would give them power over the Medicaid expansion. They could maybe roll it back. It would give them power over blocking minimum wage increases. It would give them power over stopping regulations on utilities that are ripping off Virginian customers.
That's right.
It's kind of very straightforward as to why the Republicans want to take all these people down. Now, as for liberal elites and Democrats saying that they need to resign and go, it seems like it's more of a cultural reflexive kind of cultural response or attitude that they're prescribing, which is that they believe that they have designated a group of behavior as basically an irredeemable offense. And racial offenses like making some sort of racial or insensitive insult is among the highest in this category of offenses. Apparently, even if it happened 35 years ago, when someone probably didn't have anywhere near the same attitudes and behaviors as they do now. It was interesting. Right before my segment on Tucker Carlson, Ken Cuccinelli was on, and Ken Cuccinelli is one of the most right-wing guys you'll ever meet.
Cooch. Governor Cooch, the man who wrote his thesis about how women have small lady brains.
Now this is a man who ran for governor, I believe in 2013. He was attorney general of the state of Virginia, and they ran for governor. He was defeated by the Democrats. I believe McAuliffe was the one who defeated him at
Terry
that time.
McAuliffe beat him, yeah.
And Cuccinelli was on right before me, and he also hates Northam, and he's also talking crap about, I think, the abortion stuff and all this. He just hates all that. But Tucker asked him, hey, you served with this guy in the state senate. Did you ever see him say or do anything racist? And Cuccinelli was like, honestly, no. And like everyone I know said the same thing. Like, we've never seen this guy do anything kind of racially insensitive. In fact, because Northam is governor, we had the Medicaid expansion finally, and about a third of the people who benefited from that were African American. And he won office with the support of a lot of African Americans. And really, no one has, at least in the past, 20 years or something, seen anything racially insensitive from him. So in that context, to me, it didn't really make a whole lot of sense to ask him to resign. He probably should apologize, which he did. Maybe he'll have to continue to apologize. Mm-hmm. But I think this is the new kind of cultural reflexive response from liberals, is that
that's right.
They think that if somebody, like, if someone's neurons fire the wrong way in their brain and they end up saying something stupid or doing something stupid, even if the offense is purely symbolic, it's a matter of hurt feelings and something that you can reconcile over. They feel like, no, that person's got to go. That person just revealed themselves to be like some kind of demon, right?
Right. He's
fundamentally
flawed as a human. Yeah.
They apply this logic extremely selectively because, one of the people who called for Northam to go was Kirsten Gillibrand, who was like a corporate lawyer for Philip Morris for 4 years, right? Yeah. When they were being sued for being responsible for the deaths of millions of people and lying about it. For some reason, that is not an inexcusable moral offense, but being, boneheaded, having a faux pas, and being racially insensitive at one point in your life is, and it's odd because there's many people who we would consider to be liberal heroes today, who at one point we knew were quite racially insensitive. For instance, former President Barack Obama writes in his best-selling books that at times he would cringe when he would see Mexicans, with Mexican flags, right? Mm. Like he also had that sort of bigoted, nationalistic type of impulse in his, running around his brain. Yeah. But he also was able to overcome it. Which seems like what happened with Ralph Northam. It seems like he was able to overcome it, given that throughout his professional career as a doctor and also as a politician, no one has ever seen anything like that. My former colleague, Matt Iglesias at Vox, I worked with him at Think Progress. I've seen a picture of him in an old like Arab Muslim costume. He's wearing a keffiyeh. He has like a butcher knife up.
My God.
Mean, it's a pretty offensive photograph, to be honest.
Maddie, why? Oh God, can he survive? Could he survive the appearance of such a picture?
If you Google like Matt Iglesias Arab costume, there's a couple of right-wing sites have saved that photo because they want to shame him with it. But when I worked with Matt, he was very sensitive to me. And I remember one time we all went out to eat, and I'm Muslim, and he intentionally made a point of saying, hey, we need to make sure whatever we order that Zed can eat it too, because he has dietary restrictions. So he was always very sensitive and respectful to me. Maybe a few years prior to that, I don't know when that photo was taken, probably 6 or 7 years prior. Maybe he did something stupid like that. I mean, okay, like I can move past it. I think that's a sign of like good emotional and mental health, is that when somebody does something insensitive and then they can apologize for it, that you can move on with your life. So that's my basic take on the whole thing. And it was interesting that after I went on Tucker and after I wrote the Quillette piece that started it, a lot of Republicans and Democrats wrote to me saying, you know what, I think you made some fair points here, which was interesting because I don't think there was a real political constituency for my message, because the Republicans all want Northam gone because they want to take over the state government. A lot of the Democrats want him gone because they've adopted this really kind of puritanical, reflexive, punitive approach to things like racial offense and symbolic offenses. So I really didn't think there was too big of like a constituency out there for what I was saying necessarily. But I did actually get a fair number of positive responses. And I think as time goes along, people will be able to step back and maybe also say, hey, okay, we've all done boneheaded things sometimes. Nobody was necessarily hurt, although we do understand it was insensitive. He apologized. Let's try to move on. And I do think that the foibles that Fairfax and Herring have run into have probably increased the chances that the Democrats will kind of move to the forgiveness mode, because the alternative is to turn the state government over to the Republican Party. And doing that just because some of your high office holder did something offensive decades ago, honestly, just doesn't make that much sense if your main interest is political power and using that power to benefit the lives of poor and working people and minorities, which you can do only if you have the power. If you give the power up, you can't do that anymore.
Right. So you've pointed to a lot of things. You've pointed to kind of ethical questions, strategic questions, questions of the kind of culture that this kind of scandalizing of various liberals contributes to. I wonder too if from my perspective, again, going back to the title of today's show, facing down. I think you've described what I'm calling the liberal zeitgeist very, very well. You could call it a culture war. You could call it kind of a number of people have described this and likened it to the satanic cults panics, the satanic cult panics from the 90s, or Pizzagate, or other related sex panics or other social panics that very quickly become divorced from reality and gain a certain kind of, and I'm going to use this word advisedly and as a technical term, they become hysterical in a psychoanalytic sense, which, yes, has incredibly sexist trajectory or histories rather, but using it in terms of a kind of social and psychoanalytic perspective. This is a very kind of hysterical symptom. It's a symptom of a hysterical culture, meaning that the reaction is divorced from the real terrain. I mean, my God, Virginia has been my home state for most of my life. We have actual Klansmen in the state legislature, as you're well aware, actual Klansmen. And that doesn't mean that we should, excuse people's bad behavior. But then the question becomes, we need to have, if we want to take this seriously, the question then becomes, what does it actually mean for someone to do right by their past faux pas? What would it mean for Northam to make this right? And you had some suggestions on Tucker Carlson, which I thought were quite important for reframing this from a socialist perspective.
If we are concerned for the well-being of ethnic minorities and people who are kind of on margins of society, which I think we should be, then I think we have to ask ourselves, what are some of the problems facing those people? Now, certainly insulting people does cause emotional discomfort, distress, and it would not be appropriate, particularly if Governor Northam was going around today trying to pose in photos like that and so on and so forth. I think everyone can agree on that. But we have to talk about what people in those subgroups are actually facing in Virginia today. So one fact, I don't think many people know this, is that 1 out of 3 African American children within the state of Virginia is growing up in a poor family. A family defined to be under the poverty line. That to me, if you're a kid, maybe you saw one of these photos, maybe it upset you as well. But hey, having that emotional discomfort you can get past that, with, for instance, Northam apologizing. But let's say that you are suffering from cancer and the Medicaid expansion is benefiting you because finally you can go to the doctor and get chemotherapy and get restorative other forms of restorative therapy, and then you can survive, you can prosper. If there, let's say that we took the liberal Puritanism to its highest echelon and said, okay, Governor Northam should resign because when he was 24 years old, he made a symbolic offensive gesture. Okay, Lieutenant Governor Fairfax should resign because somebody has accused him of sexual assault. The news media cannot corroborate. They've tried for months to corroborate the accusation, but they can't corroborate. But we should just believe the person, and he should resign. Yeah. Mark Herring should resign because he once dressed as a rapper, apparently in 1980, and darkened his face doing so, which is an incredibly tacky thing to do. And perhaps he should be excoriated on that front. Mm-hmm. But they also think he should resign. Yeah. That would put the Republican Party as the head of the state of Virginia. If they repealed the Medicaid expansion, we would see thousands of African Americans. I think something like over 100,000 African Americans benefited from the expansion of Medicaid. You'd be taking away healthcare coverage from people who can finally go see the doctor when they dislocate their shoulder, when they have cancer, when they catch the flu. There would actually be people who could lose their lives over that. Right now, I think, Matt, that those material issues, those substantive issues about human bodies, those have to be at the forefront, I think, of our politics when we're making decisions about what to do. That doesn't mean that when we do confront emotional or symbolic issues, that we shouldn't have a process in place for whoever did that to apologize, have reconciliation, for us to have good conversations about that. I mean, President Trump insults people on the daily basis, and I think that's wrong. I don't think the president should be insulting people constantly. It's just needless emotional discomfort. But that emotional discomfort has to come far secondary to what are the real human outcomes in terms of health, housing, wages, environmental pollution, in terms of violence. I mean, some of these issues, we're talking about funding that would be needed to control crime, which is something that, is a massive, it's a massive burden on the people, for instance, in West Baltimore, where I did a reporting trip about the homicide wave there. How many articles have we seen from liberal press about something like what Ralph Northam did 35 years ago as a symbolic offense? How many articles have we seen about the fact that in West Baltimore in around 2017, we saw decades high homicide rate, and we saw more people die from opioid overdoses than gunshot wounds? Those are real human lives who are just being ended, as if we're putting out candles in a flame. It's just gone in a flash. But for some reason, this does not create the kind of emotional backlash that makes it a national scandal. The same way it is when somebody is emotionally insensitive, racially insensitive. They make some remark or some gesture that kind of triggers people emotional responses. Those things are understandably emotional. And like I said, we should be able to have the conversations for people to apologize and reconcile in those situations. But the ultimate thing we can do, if we really care about civil rights, if Governor Northam cares about it, is he needs to address the real material human consequences for people on the ground in Virginia, because those are the things that will make it so that they can lead good lives for the rest of their lives. He can apologize for this thing and we can move on. But what about saving people's lives who are dying, who will die from sickness? What about improving people's lives by raising the minimum wage, which is one of the things I think the Democrats intend to do, but have not yet done. And certainly they wouldn't be able to do if the Republicans take over the state.
Well said. And I think, I'm going out on a limb here in a way that perhaps you wouldn't as a journalist. I'm not a real journalist. I'm just a chattering head on a podcast. So I'll go there. You can tell me if you think I'm onto something here or not, or you can, sidestep the comment. But the reality is here, we should have politicians from all identities and ethnicities and racial backgrounds and all the rest of it, but particularly the sort of black establishment in Virginia politics. We should see them, producing a robust, comprehensive plan to present to the governor to use this opportunity to make this right and to pass robust social democratic policies that would actually and tremendously benefit materially the lives of people of color in the state of Virginia. This would be a perfect opportunity for a democratic socialist or a progressive politician in the state of Virginia to get a pound of flesh out of this man. And let's not kid ourselves. Northam is no progressive. He beat a primary challenger who was endorsed by Bernie Sanders, Tom Perriello. As I'm sure you know, you can say a lot more about that than I could, being both a journalist and a Virginia resident. But so Northam is no progressive. He's a classic Southern Democrat, you might say.
I believe he actually voted for George Bush twice.
Yeah.
Which is a really interesting person for someone in a senior position in the Democratic Party, but I believe that's the history.
Yeah, there are a lot of these kind of Southern, almost like borderline Dixiecrats, minus the actual Klan hood. Of course, they go blackface instead of Klan hood, but ironically, right? So it's better than, say, Robert Byrd, for example. But anyway, I digress. Point being is this would be an excellent opportunity for be it progressive, democratic socialist, or some of the black representatives in the House or in the Virginia State Senate to get their pound of flesh. But let's ask ourselves, so why don't they do that? Why don't they come at him and sort of demand that he back this robust package to make this thing right? You fucked up, but we can come together and we can make this right and improve in serious ways the material lives of all people in Virginia, but particularly black folks in Virginia, who we know because of historical racism disproportionately benefit from these robust social safety net style programs. But they're not doing that. And why is that? Perhaps the Democratic Party, and particularly the racial representatives inside the Democratic Party, are hustling for their local, bourgeoisie. Perhaps the movers and shakers who fill their campaign coffers, each campaign season, are the slumlords, and the class of the business owners, the people who are actively gentrifying these localities. So we have to start thinking about how the superficiality of this liberal zeitgeist is directly tied to the class alignments of all of these people, regardless of their gender, ethnicity, or racial background. Do you think I'm onto something there? Maybe you can fill in some of the gaps there, being the kind of grounded journalist that you are.
I mean, I would have to know more about the particular members to go into each of their motivations. Although I think it's fair to say that if somebody in January 2019 did not favor that agenda, they're probably not going to favor it now, because people kind of go off their preconceived kind of policy benefits. But I do think that, okay, so for instance, before there was the sexual assault claim against Lieutenant Governor Fairfax, I think there were a lot of liberals who quickly jumped to, okay, Northam did something offensive 35 years ago. We should replace him with Lieutenant Governor Fairfax.
Yeah.
He's an African-American guy. He's got to be great.
He's an up-and-comer. He serves as a governor. He gets reelected. He's on the national political scene for being a black Democrat
he gets to, He's the next Stacey Abrams. We could talk quite a bit about Stacey Abrams.
And we will.
She's highly misrepresented in liberal media.
And we will, absolutely. That's one of the reasons I wanted to bring you on.
Lieutenant Governor Fairfax was a white-collar defense lawyer. He was a white-collar defense lawyer. I haven't looked too much into this, but I've heard that he actually was even represented for-profit colleges at one point, which is a sector that's known for targeting poor minorities and loading them up with debt. And I don't believe anybody who asked Northam to resign thought about what the implication would be about bringing someone who could potentially have more right-wing politics than he does, who potentially is more pro-corporate than he does. At least Northam grew up very poor, worked in working-class jobs. His legacy and lifetime was about healthcare, and he made expanding Medicaid a priority, and he was able to convince some Republicans in the legislature to make a compromise to actually be able to do it. Now, Lieutenant Governor Fairfax on the other side, this guy, his career is in white-collar defense. He's not on the side of, just because he has a certain skin color does not impute a certain type of politics.
What?
And it's just
no.
In another universe where Fairfax had former, let's say he had the same politics as somebody like Nina Turner. Let's say he had the same politics as someone like Vincent Fort in Georgia. Let's say he had the same politics as Barbara Lee. If he had these politics, people could say, hey, it's a net win because we replaced Northam with a more left-wing person who's going to be more pro-poor, more pro-working class, more pro-healthcare, more anti-corporate. That's a totally rational argument, even though on my side, I do think people should forgive Northam and be able to willing to move on. But it's a rational strategic argument for a progressive movement.
Do you think Julian Bond could move down south across the river into Virginia and make that happen?
And that, by the way, that's a fascinating one too. Is if people really want to know some interesting history, they should look up Julian Bond's race against John Lewis for Congress.
I talk about that every chance I can, Zed. We're going to talk about this, yes, because Adolph Reed Jr. brought that up on my show over a year ago.
That's
a year and a half ago.
That was a fascinating run.
And I mean, that just absolutely unsettles everything that you think you know about the progressive nature of the Congressional Black Caucus and the kind of avatars of the progressive sort of racial, civil rights ties to the arc of progress. And it just really oh man, we're going to talk about this. Yes, I'm pumped. It might be the Four Loko that's currently seizing my sizzling through my veins right now. Or I messed up, you guys. Hit me in the comments if you think that no one my age should be drinking a Four Loko at this time.
Didn't they ban the Four Lokos? Didn't Chuck Schumer get it banned?
Well, they don't have caffeine anymore.
Okay.
I've had a rough week, Zed. Yeah, rough week. Sometimes you got to really call in the big guns. Everyone should blast me and shame me for that maneuver. But I'm really excited that we're talking about that race. But let's get back to that. Let's finish this discussion. And I want to be sure that we talk about your biography because you do come from Georgia. It's rich in this kind of history. And we'll get to Stacey Abrams. We'll get to John Lewis and Julian Bond going deep into the historical archives here. That was in the late 70s, if I'm not mistaken. So let's finish up this conversation about the Virginia situation. I'm not sure really what more can be said. Northam right now is threatening to leave the Democratic Party altogether. I think he's seeing. Which, by the way,
I often would advise that regardless of whether you're in a scandal, because we need more independent politicians. But sure. That is a good escape hatch. That is a good escape hatch for him right now, I suppose.
He's a social conservative in some respects, or at least he plays one, being this kind of Southern bourbon, Virginia gentleman Democrat, the kind of people who get elected in states like that. But maybe we can push him in a more principled, leftward direction if he were to leave that gravy train behind, because we know the Democrats are plugged into the energy sector and so on. It's really corrupt.
The other thing is that Virginia has one single-term governors, so he doesn't have to run for re-election. He doesn't need a party to support him. He could totally do that. And if there are any party taboos, like let's say you don't go after a certain corrupt lawmaker because the party's defending them, he would no longer have to do anything like that. Being an independent, as Bernie Sanders has shown, does give you independence.
I wonder if he could go after Virginia Power. The way the utility companies have a death grip on the state of Virginia, the way that Delegate Lee Carter has highlighted, among many others. It makes you wonder.
One of the things I read was that the party is trying to ask Mark Warner and Tim Kaine to do their fundraising now because they're kind of embarrassed about Northam. Jeez. When you have to fundraise constantly, it's hard to fight the same people who you're fundraising with. But when you don't have to fundraise anymore, it's a whole different calculation on you. So
that's right. It's no wonder why Virginia governors are historically plugged into that national level sort of blue dog, new Democrat gravy train, because I think that connection in the single term really plays into that. You don't have a whole lot of rope to play with before it's time to start raising money again, and your proximity to D.C. and the Democratic Party machine really dictates how far you can go and where you can turn. What are the prospects? Let's wrap up this conversation on Virginia. What are the prospects of Tom Perriello sort of raising his head again in the primaries going forward, now that the Southern Democrat wing of that party has been at least put in disrepute, for better or for worse?
Yeah, I briefly had a little bit of overlap with Perriello when I was at Center for American Progress, because he started there right when I left. And I know a number of his former staff. And something I've always heard about him is that he's much more interested in foreign affairs than he is in domestic affairs, because he has done quite a bit of foreign NGO work. So I don't know how much he feels a willingness to make a run for governor again. Mark Herring, actually, who's now under fire at the Attorney General spot, I think he basically said he was going to run for governor next time. But it's a really interesting question as to whether these events of the past week will actually undermine the Democratic Party's establishment, because that establishment did circle the wagons around Northam. They did freeze out Perriello. And so it's really interesting to see if it does have those long-lasting ramifications or not, because that could conceivably weaken that establishment so that someone else could take over in the future. But, a lot of that establishment is also top-down. Northam is not necessarily the head of it. Tim Kaine and Mark Warner are also extremely influential in it, for instance, and a number of other people. For instance, the head of the Democratic Party in Georgia and Virginia used to be a for-profit college lobbyist, actually. The Virginia Democratic Party is quite strong in terms of its figureheads other than Ralph Northam. So I don't know. I would say I'm undecided about what the long-term ramifications are. I just have to wait and see.
I think, in some senses, you've got Terry McAuliffe, Mark Warner, Tim Kaine, all former governors of Virginia and players at the national level and inside the Democratic Party involved in some real down and dirty backwards shit, I would say, coming from someone who would love to see the Democrats open up its doors to this kind of progressive groundswell that it will absolutely need if it has success going into the future. And here we have three former governors in the state of Virginia holding back the barn doors closed, metaphorically speaking, preventing this progressive wave from entering the halls of power in a state like Virginia. And we'll see how that goes moving forward. But let's move beyond Virginia for just a moment in this kind of particularistic way, and we'll go to your home state. Talk to me a little bit about Georgia. You yourself are a native son of Georgia, perhaps not native, but a son of Georgia, and whether you like it or not, similar to my relationship with Virginia. Stacey Abrams was selected to give the response to the State of the Union address for the Democrats this year. There was a brief but intense scandal online that Bernie Sanders would dare to give a response after Stacey Abrams. The implication was that he was stealing the thunder of an historic, black woman of color, rather. But let's talk about the real Stacey Abrams. My guest on last week's DPS Radio, your colleague, a friend of yours, Daniel Marins, mutual friend of ours, I should say, has written quite extensively on the tale of two Staceys. One Stacey that's presented as this progressive icon, and another Stacey who's known in her home state of Georgia as a triangulator and a capitulator to the Democrats to the Republicans in that state. So who's the Stacey Abrams that you know as a native Georgian?
Well, it's interesting because I've been familiar with Abrams since at least I would say probably 2011, if not before that. And basically, it was really interesting when she announced that she was going to run for governor or run for the Democratic nomination to run for governor. There were people in the legislature who were just completely confused at her posture. There was one lawmaker, and I would say this, it's not particularly a nice thing to say, or but there's some lawmakers who said something like, oh, she considers herself black now, or something like that.
Okay.
Because there are, she was not known to be kind of a black leftist type lawmaker at all. She bragged about this during her gubernatorial race. It's not a secret that she had an A from the Georgia Chamber of Commerce. Georgia Chamber of Commerce is the most powerful right-wing lobbying group within the state of Georgia. Those are the people that killed the minimum wage hikes, that prevent regulation of business, that deregulated kind of liability for bankers in Georgia, that supported payday lenders in Georgia. These are some of the most right-wing people. She boasted about how she once had an A rating from them. This is somebody who's taken money from Koch Industries. I mean, literally, the Kochs don't just fund like any Democrat. They usually, they go for people.
No, they do not.
On the right. When I went to school in Georgia, I actually went to school for free because I had the Hope Scholarship. Mm-hmm. In 2011, the Republican governor, Nathan Deal, he wanted to cut that scholarship because Georgia was running a little bit low on lottery funding in the recession. So he said, okay, what we'll do is we'll move the GPA threshold up really high to get the full scholarship. A lot of Democrats wanted to fight that. Jason Carter, grandson of President Carter, fought it very hard. Vincent Fort, a left-wing kind of Bernie Sanders supporter in the state Senate who ran for mayor of Atlanta, fought it very hard. Abrams went into a room with Nathan Deal, came out of the room and said, hey, you know what? We got to support him. We got to support this. Yeah. This was the crown jewel program of the state of Georgia. This is as if Nancy Pelosi walked into a room with Donald Trump and said, okay, we have to support cutting Social Security.
Right.
Her excuse was basically...
She sort of went for the grand bargain in 2019.
Exactly. The grand bargain is a good analogy because what her argument was that we can't do any better, that if we fight him, he'll just make the cuts worse. We might as well just support him on the cuts. And she didn't, she had that mentality of being that kind of inside negotiator with the Republicans, consistently giving them what they want in order to either advance some policy priority of hers or maybe to advance her career. For instance, another thing during the governor's race is that she said that we should think about removing the Confederate Memorial at Stone Mountain, which is, a massive park in Georgia. It's a massive mountain and people don't know about it. It has laser shows. Which is, a fair point because it really isn't even a Civil War memorial. It really is a Confederacy memorial. It has like Confederate generals on the front. And so, that's a fair enough point. But I interviewed a lawmaker who, while she was in the legislature, introduced a piece of legislation to basically do that, to convert it into a Civil War memorial. And she told me that Abrams wouldn't support it because Abrams told her that sounds like a Black Caucus thing. Now, her response was, wait, I thought Abrams was black. But, these were the kind of decisions Stacey Abrams repeatedly made as minority leader in Georgia, repeatedly shut down the more left-wing members of her caucus, repeatedly sided with Republicans, sided with the Chamber of Commerce. But when she ran for governor, for the Democratic nomination for governor and then for governor itself in the general election, she portrayed herself as a progressive, as I'm turning a page on this, conservative Democratic politics in the state of Georgia. I'm doing this, I'm doing that. And it worked. I think a lot of San Francisco donors, New York-based donors, Washington, D.C.-based donors gave her millions of dollars to run her gubernatorial campaign on that platform. Although, to be fair to her, at least in terms of the policies she promoted, she was totally honest. She never promoted raising the minimum wage. I asked her campaign multiple times, does she support raising the minimum wage? She wouldn't even say it. Georgia's state minimum wage is $5.15. Like, it doesn't even match the national minimum wage. She wouldn't even say, "Oh, let's raise it to $5.30."
Like it would. Astonishing.
She didn't even say that. She didn't. She promoted financial literacy as a big solution to poverty, which I don't. Financial literacy is important, but it kind of helps for the people to have money too, to be financially literate with.
Yeah, we've seen these joke budgets that like McDonald's comes up with to try to to teach their
she actually based
employees how to get by.
Platform off of like what some banks were doing, like with their like social responsibility or nonprofit wings of like going to people and teaching them about banking or something. But her platform was like one of the most conservative platforms I'd seen for someone who ran for governor. And what's really interesting is somebody running one state south, Andrew Gillum, had a fairly liberal platform, actually, including raising corporate taxes, expanding healthcare, raising the minimum wage, and she had none of that.
So it was possible, given the kind of ideological and racial makeup of that state. She had so much. She had a lot of steam going into that election, I would say. And she could have used that capital for progressive ends, and she chose not to. I think that's a safe thing to say. Would that be accurate?
Well, that's what's interesting is she's received so much applause for the gubernatorial race that now she's being courted by national Democrats to run for the U.S. Senate seat. There are at least a couple other people who are considering running for that seat. And my question to all these people is, what exactly was so amazing about her campaign and about her time as a legislator that makes you think this person who lost should run again? Like, if she came very close to winning, but her platform was amazing, her record was amazing, it's, just like Bernie Sanders lost the Democratic nomination, people want him to run again because there's a lot of very unique things about him that only he could bring to the table. What does Abrams bring to the table that another Georgia Democrat would not bring to the table? I'm kind of at a loss. And there's nothing really from her campaign that she popularized as a policy that Georgia is now going to pursue. It was completely forgettable. And yet, I think she's going to continue to get the really positive national press because she so strongly stressed her demographic. She stressed the fact that she's a black woman. Well, I'll give a fact to people who don't know much about Georgia, but the majority of the Democratic caucus in the state of Georgia is African American. Yeah. Some of them are progressive, some of them are conservative, some of them are kind of moderate.
What?
There are plenty
you
of
mean
people
race
in the
doesn't
state
constitute a political constituency in and of itself? I don't believe it.
I mean, it's, yeah. Well, I mean, what was wild is that it seemed like she was almost getting hit from both ends because one, she had zero populist economic policy, so it would be very hard for her to win over some of those swing voter types who maybe would be appealing. And at the same time, I do think a lot of Republicans portrayed her as if she was Cynthia McKinney or something, like a very staunch left winger.
I see.
Which meant that she basically was, in a year that was very good for Democrats around the country, she really didn't have any real electoral advantages that could have gotten her over the hump. And I don't see it being very different in 2020 if she were to run again, she probably would run the exact same way since she has no incentive not to, because all the Democrats are going to give her money and fame regardless.
Yeah. So her opponents in the Republican Party almost really carried water for her in presenting her as this, far left radical, whereas she was nothing of the sort. And I think in a sense, kind of progressives nationwide are falling for that characterization of these far right Republicans inside of the state of Georgia. That's really fascinating because that seems to be the case to me. Because when you really talk to the people inside the state of Georgia, they see no such thing. And many times, this was such a hotly contested general election in the state of Georgia, where many people come away from that feeling like she was robbed by the powers that be. Very similar to Bush v. Gore, circa the year 2000. And so I think that the emotions run so deep and so hot from the general election that they forget that she had to run a primary against a challenger to her left. And many people who you would think if race constitutes a coherent political constituency, you would think those types of people would be in Abrams' camp, but they were not. A lot of congressional Democrats in the state, black Democrats in the state, were sort of cautiously behind her opponent in the primary. Is that correct?
The head of the Black Caucus in Georgia actually didn't endorse in the race. He sat it out altogether. Unless he endorsed at the very end, I don't remember. But I remember it was most of the race was done and he hadn't said anything. He's out, I think, towards Savannah. And a lot of African-American lawmakers, I think, did that because, one, they don't want to go up against this juggernaut of like national donors who are promoting this as the first black female governor of Georgia. Mm-hmm. But they also didn't want to support someone who they knew was consistently selling them out in the legislature and siding with the Republican right. So a lot of them sat it out. A few of them ended up endorsing Stacey Abrams, the opponent. Vincent Fort, who's probably the most progressive guy in Georgia, he got it signed into law, this very aggressive anti-payday lending bill that basically the entire like financial industry in the United States tried to stop and then successfully defanged a few years later. He endorsed Stacey Abrams, and a number of others had, but all the kind of the Netroots type organizations got behind Abrams. I mean, a lot of this started when there was the Netroots Nation conference in Atlanta, and there were a number of African-American protesters who interrupted Stacey Abrams' speech and started chanting "Trust Black Women," started chanting, basically they were protesting her because she was white, which to me is a very prejudicial thing to do. But apparently in this space, this subculture, this is a very normal thing to do.
Well, it's clueless. It's clueless. I mean, she's, Daniel Marins wrote, you wrote quite a bit about this as well. I just happened to have been looking through this, having Daniel on the show last week. But, at the time, Atlanta Mayor Kasim Reed met with Evans and was, at least at that time, a supporter of Evans, was gushing about her very powerful message that she had for the world. And so, it's odd that the kind of BLM protest crew would show up at Evans' campaign event just because she's a white woman, when a tremendous amount of, really real movers and shakers and progressive bona fides in the state of Georgia, long-standing black leaders were behind Abrams' opponent. And all of this just gets, let's return back to the national context. All of this is just completely, looked obfuscated. I almost said whitewashed, but maybe that's a bad designation there, given the composition of what's going on. But what do you make of this? This seems to be really part and parcel of the kind of representative of the strategy of a certain sector of the Democratic Party that is just desperately trying to stave off the progressive challenge to their power.
What's interesting, Adam, is that it's definitely true the Democratic establishment plays these, presses these buttons and plays these cards effectively. The question is, are there people opposed to the establishment who kind of buy into it or fall for it? There were a number of kind of left-wing groups like Justice Democrats that went after a white congressman in Massachusetts, Michael Capuano. This guy was known as a strident opponent of the banks, a strident opponent of war. He wasn't like a Bernie left-winger by any means, but he was probably like as liberal as like a left-winger as you get within like the typical class of Democrats. They went after him and successfully defeated him with another person, Ayanna Pressley, who was a Boston city councilor. And they never made a single policy argument against him. They never said we asked people who endorse, like, I believe we asked Democracy for America. We asked other people, hey, so what has Capuano done that's so wrong? And they were all like, he's a decent member of Congress, but we need this woman. And it seemed like they basically took him out because he's white, which to me is like an extremely reactionary thing to do, is to target a lawmaker because of their race. And the crazy thing is she's actually more right-wing than he is in some respects. So for instance, he promised that he would oppose the anti-BDS things because he's close to the peace community in Massachusetts. When Ayanna Pressley was asked the same question by Massachusetts Peace Action, she left the entire thing blank on the paper. One of the first things she does after getting elected is she goes and she hangs out with some of the pro-Israel community, says that she really values the strategic partnership between Israel and the United States. When Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, two Muslim women who are pro-Palestinian, were elected to Congress, have been under attack. She's done nothing to defend them.
Yeah.
She's been in a lot of photographs with them because this is the cool new women of color freshmen.
Yeah, she wants to make she wants to make the cover of Time magazine, but she's not ready to stick her neck out when it really matters in terms of these kind of policy stances.
In terms of the pure optics, she's tried to co-opt their type of politics. Like, look, I'm one of these people. But then she goes back home and she goes and speaks before people who are in the pro-Israel community and talks about how much she will defend Israel. She doesn't endorse this push by Rashida Tlaib to make members of Congress go and visit the West Bank and see what Palestinians are living through, which they almost never do because all the money is to go visit Israel. Donors will give you money if you visit Israel. They'll pay for the trip to Israel. They took out a member of Congress. Left-wingers did this. This wasn't the Democratic establishment. The establishment was actually behind Capuano. They were like, okay, we don't want to give everyone of our own. But left-wingers took this person out because he was white, basically.
This
was
the Justice
black.
Democrats, just to be clear, because I'm a little
right.
I'm not up on this.
Well, Justice Democrats, and I believe there were some other kind of leftish organizations within Massachusetts, and maybe some national ones that also supported Presley over Capuano. And again, I want to stress again, Capuano is not like a Bernie type left winger. He endorsed Hillary during the primary, although Presley did too. In fact, Presley attacked single payer as a plan without a price tag or something like that. But she headlined an anti-Bernie conference, press conference right before the primary when Bernie narrowly lost Massachusetts.
Wow.
And it's just like,
that was a real turning point, just to remind people.
It is actually.
Yeah,
I'll say this, and I rarely call stuff racist because the word is just thrown out nonstop, but it's kind of racist to just look at somebody and assume their politics without actually investigating the actual politics they have and looking at their history and their record and their values and giving them like the wholeness of a person.
Well, that is the irony here, right? This extreme wokeness is in itself. It is racist because you're ascribing certain characteristics to someone based on the color of their skin. And I had I dared to make a similar point in criticizing Stacey Abrams earlier this week, and somebody's Discord chat emptied out onto my Twitter feed, and it was like 280 people telling me some variation of some Twitter clapback like "This ain't it, Chief," or "Nice cold take, bro," or something along those lines. And so people are just.
I mean, in my view, okay, so I remember when like Black Lives Matter protesters interrupted Bernie Sanders a number of times, and I definitely think there were areas on criminal justice to push Bernie Sanders that was legitimate. Sure. But some of the things they said just really didn't make any sense. And I think if you pointed that out to this group of people you're talking about, they would say, "Oh, you're being disrespectful. You're not with it. You're not." But here's the thing. If you really respect somebody, you're going to give them the fullness of their personality to say, "Hey, I agree with you here. I disagree with you there." Yeah. And you're going to be able – that's true respect. It's just condescending to be like, okay, well, you're a certain skin color, so you must be right. Everything you say is right. It's patronizing.
You just pat them on the head, right? You pat them on the head. Yeah, everything you say, you're doing such a good job using these big words and these big thoughts. Good job. Like, what the fuck? That's racist as hell. The liberal NGO space is full of people like this, but that's not ordinary people. Dude, I grew up, I was born in like Mapleton, Georgia, which is like this small, mostly minority town, a little bit poorer. Later I moved to a wider part of Georgia. They're like middle of my childhood. And, everyone I knew growing up, almost nobody would be offended by saying, "Hey, I agree with some of what you say, but I don't agree with the other parts of it." Or like, "I value what you have to say. I value you as a person, but hey, man, I'm just not with that." This idea that you have to like instantly like bow down, like one of the chants that like one of the hashtags that went up against Bernie Sanders during all this was "bow down Bernie." Like, that's just not like a well-adjusted person doesn't say something like that. And most people, ethnic minority groups, don't say stuff like that. But the problem is people who work in liberal NGOs are not surrounded by like, working and middle-class people working ordinary jobs. They're surrounding people who are in a constant like virtue signaling competition and like prestige economy where you're just going to say things that make less and less sense to ordinary people, but make a lot of sense when your job is to like race to the bottom in this rhetoric. And so, I think we have already seen polling about this. Like Bernie Sanders is literally the second most popular candidate in America among racial minorities, with Biden being number one. And Biden, of course, is going to go down because Biden has basically faced no negative press or oppo research at this point. He's like in the same position Hillary was at the start of that race. Bernie is actually fairly popular with people from ethnic minority backgrounds. He's actually he's beating Kamala Harris in that group right now. If you look at polling,
there isn't like a massive group of people who are angry just because he happened to give a State of the Union response around after Stacey Abrams, not even at the same time as her. Of course, Kamala Harris gave one too. I think Sherrod Brown was on TV talking about it probably too.
Mm-hmm.
Like these things, these things really mess with your mind, because if you see some people online saying it, even if those people are not representative of anyone, you have to be like, oh, okay, well, that must be what every black person in America thinks. Well, gosh, I had no idea Twitter was such a great, like, longitudinal and like demographic survey of America. I think we should just defund all the universities and, run our polls on Twitter, and then we'll get at the truth that way.
Yeah. Well said. Well said. I think, this is something we've been pushing on DPS for the last couple of months explicitly, and really explicitly since we started DPS Radio. People need to get very comfortable with the reality that the discourse, in scare quotes, but it's a thing, but it's put it in scare quotes because we understand it's divorced from reality. The discourse is shaped by people who are cynically wielding various critiques for opportunistic aims. It's just that fucking simple. And the closer you get, I'll say this. 2 years ago, I was just some schmuck in grad school who sort of read about these stories from the outside. I didn't really know a lot of people who were involved in this world. 2 years later, fast forward, I have a relatively popular podcast, and I find myself surrounded in this world of kind of punditry and these thought leaders, and you really start to see it in a different way. And I know you're farther up in the echelons of the kind of media sphere than I am. You've done your rounds for a lot longer than I have, and so I know you see it. But it's just so transparent the way that, again, disrupt the Bernie Sanders speech. You've got yourself a campaign or NGO job. It's like a job. It's like a job interview is what it is for these people. That's all it is. And I hate to put people's intentions in disrepute or what have you, because there are some well-intentioned people out there. But even the well-intentioned people get snatched up by the discourse machine. And, if they don't have their heads screwed on straight, or if they're neophytes. I should
say this.
Yeah, go ahead.
I should say this, and since I've been bashing this group of people for probably half an hour, my intention is not to demonize people who are kind of running some of these segments of the political discourse. They're responding to incentives just like anyone else. They're in a culture just like anyone else.
Sure. They gotta have a job. They need a job. They need a paycheck.
Like one of the people who basically shut down a Bernie Sanders rally in the Pacific Northwest, I think it was in Seattle. I think that was Marissa Johnson. Yeah. Like Marissa Johnson, right after the general election, she started selling something called a safety pin box. And like the safety pin box was like, this is a box we're going to send you. And if you're a good white person who cares about minorities, you have to buy this box. Why is she an authority to give me a box to tell me how to be not racist? Well, I don't know why, but like she needs a job. And like, if the incentives are such that people are actually going to buy the box, then she'll sell. I mean, that's how capitalism works. She'll sell the box. But we at least, without demonizing her, without being mean about it or whatever, we should at least recognize that this is a hustle.
Yes, like, it's not about being exactly. That's right, and that's what I mean.
Money doing this.
Our emphasis is never to say that someone's a very bad person, therefore they're canceled, therefore whatever. Is that we shouldn't listen to them because they're capital V, very capital B bad. It's just to recognize that material relationships trump various kind of discursive framings. And sure, she cares about social justice. These are the impassioned pleas that sort of come out of her mouth. But, her material relationship to this movement is one where she's selling, political. Oh God, what was it called in the early Catholic Church when you would buy your way out of hell? What was that called? You're a Muslim. You wouldn't be able to help me here, probably. Someone in the comments hit me. Someone hit me with this.
Yeah, I don't know what that.
I'm a bad Christian.
I understand what you're saying.
I'm a bad Christian.
I mean, buying yourself out of duties is a long tradition in a human history, though. I mean, in the Civil War, people, remember in the Civil War, people could avoid the draft if they like had enough money,
Oh,
basically,
okay.
right? Like
I see.
in the war where everybody was killing each other over such a stupid cause, which is maintaining slavery, you could buy your way out of it. And this poor schmuck who didn't own any slaves, who had no plantation,
Yeah,
who had
that's
no
true.
material stake in slavery continuing, he would have to get drafted into the army. And by the way, if he tries to run away, they'll shoot him. But
Yeah,
but you could buy your way out of it. It was your duty to serve in that army, supposedly. You could buy your way
yeah.
out of it. And I think that's a
Indulgences,
good way.
indulgences. That's
That's
my
a good way to think about it. Like,
yeah,
if you're white, like self-flagellating yourself in front of other people is not actually improving anyone's life.
yeah,
It's just giving someone like a momentary like dopamine rush in their brain, or maybe it's making somebody some money if they're selling you something like this box. The way that you'd improve other people's lives is go down to the homeless shelter, find out what they need, volunteer, get involved in political activities to redistribute more resources, because resources are what America runs on. Unfortunately, we don't have to love capitalism, but that's how it works. So there are things you can actually do to help people, but what I've noticed is you should be somewhat distrustful of somebody who's telling you, give me money so you can absolve yourself of sin or guilt.
yeah,
Because
yeah.
typically people who do that in politics or people who do that in religion are, they're kind of on the wrong track.
But that is, I mean, I think correct me if I'm wrong here. I'm woefully, I'm just woefully ignorant about most religion, aspects of religion, despite being the son of a preacher man, at least a Protestant one. But as the commenters have corrected me, that is the history of indulgences, that you would buy indulgences from the Catholic Church to buy your way out of sin. I don't know if there's any parallel in the history of Islam. I'm not sure. I'm sure. I mean, corruption.
I mean, in Islam, we are encouraged to give to charity,
Sure,
like
sure.
it's called zakat, which is like
Yeah,
usually 2.5%. Um,
yeah.
as far as giving more money than somebody else or buying absolution from guilt or sin, I don't know about that.
That would be probably frowned upon.
It's probably not something. Um,
You guys don't
it's
have the
not.
corruption of the degree of the Catholic Church or the Anglican Church. I would say
No,
that's fair.
although the corruption they have in Islam is in the form of terrorist organizations and stuff like that. So we have our own problems, but
So
I
you mean
wouldn't
like
say
the
most of our
flotilla
problems.
that tried to
Oh
penetrate
yeah,
the
yeah,
Gaza Strip? Is that the terrorist that you're
that's
speaking?
true.
Uh,
Kirsten Gillibrand wanted to investigate the flotilla for terrorism. I mean, this is like she like signed. She helped write. First of all, she helped write the Senate letter for this, and then she got like 80 of her colleagues to sign it. And of course, Bernie Sanders did not sign this nonsense, but
yeah, yeah.
and Warren was not in the Senate at that point yet. I don't know if she would have signed it or not. It's an interesting question.
Yeah, well,
Um,
I just gotta, I gotta jump. I'm enjoying the hell out of this conversation. You, my friend, are just a wealth of knowledge. I've been wanting to have you on the show for a very, very long time, and I'm happy to say that I've not been let down. And I feel like you and I could go all night. Unfortunately, we only have the stream for 2 hours, and so I want to be able to, I want to be sure that we're getting our money's worth and are spending our time wisely. I want to get to some of the questions from our commenters. Those of you in the live audience who are hanging on to every word that at least Zed is saying, not necessarily myself. Pitch us some questions, and we will try our best to answer those as we get to them. But I want to pitch your stuff. You have a blog that my audience needs to know about. It's 2020watch.org. And you have been absolutely prolific on that outlet. You scroll through this. You've got a piece every other day with a really, I think, important perspective on some of the leading candidates that are shaping up in the Democratic Party primary today. The story that you just mentioned for Kirsten Gillibrand appears, I think, 6 or 7 stories down. Early February, you put that piece out. But it's very much in line with the kind of position that we've taken here on DPS Radio in analyzing some of the candidates. Tell me a little bit about your take on Elizabeth Warren. You had a really fascinating article that appeared in Jacobin Magazine a couple of weeks ago. You have an intimate relationship, at least an intimate past relationship with the Warren campaign. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so in 2012, during that campaign cycle, I was working for Progressive Change Campaign Committee, which is a political action committee, primarily small donor funded, that kind of helps progressive candidates. Their marquee candidate that year was Elizabeth Warren, who had been convinced by Chuck Schumer and some of the Netroots folks to run for Senate. And so, I raised a lot of money for her. I helped recruit a lot of volunteers for her to make phone calls for her. I did some writing in support of her. And basically, yeah, in fact, out of any candidate I've directly worked for, she might be the number one in terms of how much I personally helped her get elected. But I think, the interesting thing about her is, and I don't know how much actual voters do this because the polling doesn't seem to show this, but among like the liberal activist class, she and Bernie Sanders are viewed as interchangeable often. Like I think a lot of people in DC, like, where we are, they think that like Warren is a more polished, less polarizing version of Bernie Sanders.
That's right.
But actually that's not at all correct. Like I think it almost speaks to the superficiality of American politics and like the two-party dominance that like we can't really see that there are big differences between these two people and that there's more than one way to like antagonize the political and economic class. So I think Warren was a Republican up until 1996. She gave a very, intricate interview about why she changed from Republican to Democrat. And the main reason she said that she changed is because she felt like the Republican Party basically was not standing up for like fair market competition. She felt like they had been a little too corrupted by money and they were tilting the playing field. They didn't really believe in markets anymore like she does. I don't think she was lying or being cynical or political. I think she's being fairly honest when she says something like that, because all her work as an academic, as a bankruptcy expert, as all her writing is geared around kind of making the American economy more sort of fairly competitive, like, writing the rules of the road. Like it's no surprise that her marquee impact on the federal government was establishing the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which basically lays down regulations so that, if you're a credit card customer, you're not going to get ripped off. If you're, the companies are basically playing by fair rules. That's really her focus. And that focus does antagonize the wealthy, corporate lobbyists, Democratic establishment sometimes. There are some issues where she really butts heads with them on that. But that is very different than being somebody like Bernie Sanders, who was often a minor party socialist in parts of his life, was an independent that defeated Democrats and Republicans, who has constantly intervened in Democratic primaries for more left-wing candidates. Warren, I think, only intervened in something like 5 primaries in 2018, and not always for the most left-wing candidate. She actually, like in Ohio, for instance, she intervened for the more right-wing candidate, not the more left-wing candidate. Bernie Sanders' theory of the world is that there should be a political revolution, that the political class should basically be wiped out, economic class should basically be replaced by basically a small d democratic movement of people. Whereas Warren has, even in her foreign policy address, basically said that, hey, everything was basically going okay until the 80s, until Reagan came in, we made bad trade deals, financialization, et cetera, et cetera. Warren is kind of trying to bring the American political system kind of back to where it was pre-Reaganism, whereas Sanders did not view it as very legitimate even prior to Ronald Reagan. He didn't really like JFK. He didn't like Nixon. He didn't think the Republican Party was okay until 1996. They actually are coming from very different kind of political spaces, even if they do both antagonize some of the wealthy interests in DC in some ways.
I mean, my take on this is very, very, very similar to yours, and I really enjoyed your article when it came out in Jacobin. I mean, I don't know. I mean, correct me if you think I'm off base here, but I think I even go even further, maybe more bombastic than your concerns about Elizabeth Warren. I think she's actively dangerous because she puts forward a number of policies that, on the face of them, are quite they're quite a challenge to the status quo. They are a threat to the ruling class, and yet she does not have the kind of analysis or the strategic orientation that has the chance of kind of garnering the capacities in society to see those policies through. And so should she become president, which I think we both agree right now, she doesn't have a snowball's chance in hell. But let's just imagine a world in which someone like Elizabeth Warren, with all of her gaffes and her lack of relatability that she has. Let's imagine she became president, and she starts pushing these policies that she has. She doesn't have a real class-oriented understanding of the economy and of society, and as such, she just sort of thinks that fair-minded people will sort of latch on to these ideas, and they'll see that markets should be more fair, and we should sort of tame capitalism in these ways and make capitalism sort of run more as it, quote, should, And I think a more Marxist kind of socialist principled left-wing understanding of capitalism is one that understands that capitalism can't help itself. It is relentlessly concerned with profit and class power, despite the moral or ethical inclinations of the actors involved therein. But Warren doesn't seem to have any grasp of that whatsoever, nor does she have any understanding of how to marshal the forces in society and inside the economy to pull off the policies that she would like. So she would fail. She would fail. She would fall flat on her face. And in that effort would potentially set back the left for more than a generation in the wake of that failure, I think. That's a scary, scary prospect if you really think about it.
Well, one of the things we have to think about, and there are also like policy differences. Like for one, Warren is not even talking about single payer on the campaign trail. Like she's actively avoiding the topic. She's talking about we need to focus on defending the ACA, drug prices. Maybe we'll do Medicare for all. It's not something you can just maybe do. It's like a titanic like political fight, much bigger than the ACA if you decide to do it, which makes me think she'll probably back off it, considering she didn't even endorse it until 2017. It's probably not a big priority. But okay, let's put aside. And the foreign policy is quite different in that Sanders has assembled a really good roster of left-wing advisors, some of whom I know personally. Warren has assembled basically ex-Obama people, which you can imagine sort of where their ideology is. But okay, let's put aside all that ideological and policy difference. Warren is also a political neophyte.
Yeah.
She has won 2 races in her life. The very first one was because basically the entire Democratic Party united behind her. They actually pushed out a more left-wing opponent in the primary to basically cancel the Democratic primary in Massachusetts, and then everyone was supporting her. I was supporting her in the outside group I was in to get elected to office. Second race that she just won was basically a gimme. I mean, it was 2018. You're in blue state Massachusetts, whatever. That's very, very different than somebody like Bernie Sanders, who had to run as an independent against both Democrats and Republicans, which is almost impossible to win because we have a stupid electoral system. He did that consistently. He's run, I don't know, probably more than a dozen races. He actually understands politics pretty well because he's been such an underdog in it. Whereas Warren kind of had her political career kind of handed to her. I'm not trying to tarnish Warren's character or her abilities. She's a brilliant senator. She may be the smartest senator. She's a brilliant kind of policy scholar. But running 2 races in a very safe seat that were largely handled by other people other than you versus Bernie Sanders assembling a ragtag group of hippies to defeat Democrats and Republicans when they were all against him, sometimes by only a few votes, like when he first ran mayor of Burlington. He clearly has a lot more political skill and experience than she does. Yeah. And I have to ask people, do you really think that Elizabeth Warren is going to go toe-to-toe with Kirsten Gillibrand, with Cory Booker, some of these more experienced people who've been involved in politics for decades, who run very, very dirty, cutthroat races against other people, against somebody like Kamala Harris, who my friend Lee Fong published a great story today demonstrating that she used mailers with gang members and things like that to tarnish her left-wing opponent to get elected in San Francisco in the DA race. Do you really think that Elizabeth Warren can go to the distance with these people when she really has never had that kind of campaign before, whereas Bernie Sanders has had many campaigns against people who are willing to play dirty politics?
Yeah. I know Lee's busy, but damn it, Zed, you got to help me. Get Lee on DPS Radio next week. Let's tag team the guy and get him on here. He has a lot of interesting insights. But I think you're absolutely right about that. The thing about Warren is that, I'd push back a little bit. And I think I understand what you mean. Obviously she's smart. She's brilliant in her own way. She is a very accomplished legal scholar. You got to give her that. She's got a Harvard pedigree, and she's published and cited and studied as anyone. But the Bruinigs did, and some more DC locals did a really great podcast on one of Warren's book, wherein she makes some claims about, the dissolution of the single breadwinner household and how that plays into the decline of American prosperity and the decline of the American middle class. And they just, Matt and Liz Bruinig just completely blow this to shreds. I can't remember if that's a Patreon-only episode or if that's freely available on the feed. But either way, I'll put that up in the show notes so that listeners can try to tune into that if they can. But people really should. And so, in a sense, yes, as a legal scholar, Liz Warren is quite capable. But as in terms of broader kind of visioning of how political economy sort of plays out in the last 50 years, I think she has a very thin and tenuous grasp of these dynamics. Whereas I think Bernie Sanders has a much more, like you said, a kind of class-oriented political economic perspective of the decline of wages and class power in the wake of neoliberalism and neoliberal globalization and the outsourcing of jobs and the disintegration of workers' protections. You just don't hear Liz Warren talking about these types of things.
Well, one of the issues, so when we think about what a president actually does, I mean, this is often lost when we're looking at Instagrams of people and Beto's road trip diaries. But what a president actually does, they basically have like 3 jobs that are different from like being a senator, which is one, they conduct the foreign affairs of the country, which is something where Sanders has a much more left-wing point of view that you can see over decades, whereas Warren seems to think American foreign policy was pretty good until like the 80s, and mostly because we made bad trade deals after, according to our foreign policy speech. They do that. The second thing they do is they make appointments. They staff the entire government. And the third thing they do is they kind of like write regulations. Warren would probably be pretty good at writing regulations. In terms of staffing the government, you can look at her staff. Her staff have never been radicals. You know, Bernie is the kind of person who brings in people who are far outside the normal realms of power to be his staff, his campaign. Warren is fairly conventional Democratic staff, would suggest that she had fairly conventional Obama-style appointments. She probably would have a much better Treasury Department than Barack Obama, because that was a big problem for hers. Yeah. But, you know, in sitting on the Armed Services Committee for several years now, in anticipation for running for president, she never used that committee to seriously analyze the military budget and to go after contractors. We know that she's done the opposite as a senator at times, advocating for military programs that benefit her state, which is a fairly normal thing for a senator to do. I'm not singling her out, but again, it's a fairly normal thing to do. Bernie Sanders was willing, even when they packaged Russia sanctions in with the Iran sanctions to make everybody vote for them, even then he was willing to vote no, because he knew it was wrong to put more sanctions on Iran, and particularly right after they had suffered an ISIS terror attack. Warren went ahead and voted yes. Warren, I think, because she came into office around the time of the financial crisis, and she's very, very smart about banks, and she really did stand up to them many times, I think her kind of credentials were exaggerated for a certain portion of political watchers. They kind of assumed that because she did stick her neck out and fight the banks and fight the Obama administration with respect to finance, that this means that she's someone who would fight pharma, fight insurance, be great on climate, be great on foreign policy, but she doesn't have that coherent she doesn't really have a coherent populist left-wing worldview. She really is somebody who could have fit in very well as a liberal Republican prior to Reagan, understood where they went wrong on banking and finance, and was quite upset about that, rightly. But she never really developed. She's not the same kind of worldview as somebody who invited Noam, like Bernie Sanders as mayor of Burlington, literally invited Noam Chomsky to come speak before the city of Burlington. Like, she probably doesn't even know who Noam Chomsky is, despite the fact that she, represented him and she was at Harvard. But it really is a different worldview, and there can be people who prefer Warren. There can be people who say, I think the political and economic system in America is mostly good, although it leans a little bit too much towards banks, and we need someone smart in there to fix that. That's a perfectly valid point of view to have, but don't confuse that with somebody who basically wants to eliminate the political class as it currently stands, replace it with a massive social movement, which is kind of what Bernie Sanders wants to do.
Yeah, we could talk about Warren for the rest of the night, but unfortunately, we're going to have to move on because we have a couple more topics we want to catch up to before we wrap things up. I've got a couple of questions on the board already. If you're watching the show live and enjoying what you're hearing, pitch us some questions. They can be about the 2020 primaries. Dylan Gray speaks to my feelings about this, even though I talk about this incessantly on DPS. I myself am also completely sick and disgusted and tired of the Democratic Party primaries, and they haven't even begun. But I do think, let me backtrack. The reason why we push them so heavily, and I would think this is probably correct for you too as well, Zed, where I think that they really bring into sharp relief the critical distinctions and tensions and potential ruptures that exist in the power blocks and the political classes at present. And I think that anyone who has a stake in this should be pushing as hard as they can against the status quo in favor of more, I think, popular measures. These are measures, Medicare for all, being the one at the top of the list, that has a tremendous amount of buy-in from the American public across the ideological spectrum. And so I think as much as we hate this, I think we should choke back our gag reflex and keep fighting, because there's a lot at stake here. What are your thoughts here? You've got a blog called 2020 Watch. You of all people, why do you think why are you taking this so seriously? I mean, I guess we shouldn't take anything for granted here. Why are the primaries so important for you?
I mean, I think that, I was talking to someone earlier today who works for BBC, and he just wanted to get my thoughts on some of the 2020 stuff. And he asked me something about, like, what do I think about Bernie Sanders' chances this time? And I think something people kind of have to realize about this is that he actually has a better chance this time than he did last time. And last time he almost won the primary. And in the United States, the Democrats and Republicans unfortunately control basically the entire presidential system. It's a pretty decent chance he would have been president of the United States right now had he won the primary. There's a pretty decent chance that he will be president of the United States in 2021 if he wins the primary this time. If you think about it, if you truly believe that this person represents a fundamental shift in politics were he to become president, and the only way, or at least the way that he's chosen to do that, because he's kind of ruled out running independent, but the way that he's kind of said is that the only way he'll run for president is through a Democratic Party, and he has a pretty good chance of winning that primary, then it seems like something that you have to kind of invest yourself in and follow, because there's a real significant chance of social and political change there. Whether you're for Bernie or for somebody else, whoever the president is extremely powerful. It's an extremely powerful position. I mean, you theoretically, as president, you could use your pardon power on thousands of people if you wanted. Theoretically, as president, you could start a nuclear war and end life on Earth. President is a very powerful position, right? For good and evil.
Damn it, Zed, we're trying to sleep tonight. Donald Trump has the keys, right. The nuclear codes.
Well, the good thing, that's why I don't want them to ban him from Twitter ever. I mean, I'm a free speech guy, but besides that, I think if he banned from Twitter, that the only way he could entertain himself or let loose his anxiety loose would be with war. So it's probably best that he just has Twitter.
He'd be doing lines of Adderall off of the red phone with the nuclear codes or whatever instead of his smartphone.
And look, I'm not telling anyone to vote for Bernie Sanders or vote for Warren or whatever. You can vote however you want. I don't, I'm not my job to make endorsements or anything. But what I am saying is that the president is an extremely powerful position. And quite frankly, it seems like we have a lot of people running for president who haven't really done a whole lot with their lives. If you're going for the most powerful position on planet Earth, maybe you should have passed some legislation. Maybe you should have made some very difficult political choices for the better when there wasn't, when everything was up against you.
I don't know.
I mean, running for
Zed, you make a good point. You make a good point, but I think you even overstate the relatability of this class of candidates, because the kind of person you're describing is just kind of a burnout. And I think most of us relate with burnouts more than we relate with Cory Booker, for example.
I can slightly relate to Beto O'Rourke and his stoner trip right now, except that I'm not like this favorite son who married into a billionaire family who could afford to just take a year off randomly, right? So
but Zed, he can do a kickflip. He can do a fucking kickflip. I mean, my God.
I went to I have some I about to have some family in Texas because my fiance is from Texas originally. So I've been to Texas. I like Whataburger is a pretty cool place. I don't eat beef.
Do they have a bean burger?
I'm a hippie, but their milkshakes and French fries, not very good for you, but occasionally it's good to have. Like what he was doing with that campaign was actually he was hitting every cultural button. He's good looking. He was optimistic. He's positive. I really understand why people have such a strong emotional reaction to the campaign. What really got me, though, is when people started saying he should run for president. Because I'm like, man, this guy passed 3 bills when he was in Congress. One of them was rename a building or something. And the other 2 were fairly minor. And it's most powerful person on planet Earth, the person who has to sign and write trade deals, the person who has to conduct our wars, the person who appoints Supreme Court justices. It's probably a bigger skill set than looking cool outside of Whataburger. And I admit he looks cool. I admit he's a really cool guy. I've talked to him before. I like talking to him. He is a fun, friendly person. But president is a big job, guys. You put on your big boy pants when you're voting for president. That's the only thing I'll tell people about how to vote.
I agree. I don't disagree with you. However, go back in history and find me one president that ticks those boxes that you've just suggested. The vast majority of people have little to no actual record. Obama was a junior senator who had very little, policy victories, concrete policy victories to hang his hat on. George W. Bush's only real claim to fame was being a president's son, with some DUI arrests and some cocaine possession charges. Bill Clinton was a relatively unknown governor from the southern state of Arkansas. You could argue that George H. Bush, was the most well-known with the most kind of distinguished policy record in terms of he ran the national security state of the United States and was involved in that world for the better part of like 35, 40 years prior to his election. But even before that, you've got relative nobodies. So is that just kind of the way that we do things?
I don't want to out him, but he's a big boy. He'll take it. I remember one time I was arguing with my former boss about Beto, or I was just like, not arguing, just talking to him. And he brought up Abraham Lincoln. He's like, well, Abraham Lincoln didn't have much experience. And I said, okay, if there's a massive civil war and Beto gets us through it, like I'll say Beto's like Lincoln. But but honestly though, it's funny to me that Kamala Harris has hired so many Clinton people into her campaign, and that Hillary Clinton herself has not really endorsed her, but at least praised her. Singled her out for praise. Mm-hmm. But Kamala has no experience. Kamala has never actually been like a lawmaker, except when she joined the Senate, and she hasn't passed any bills. She passed 0 bills. Yeah. And that's not because no bills have passed by Democrats during the Trump administration either. Elizabeth Warren helped restructure the entire hearing aid market during the Trump administration, right? And Bernie Sanders in a Republican Senate, or it might be a Democratic Senate at that point, but it was a bipartisan bill. It could only pass bipartisan. He restructured the entire Veterans Administration in a very successful manner that ended a crisis, working with Republicans. So Kamala Harris, if she really wanted to get stuff done, she could focus herself on getting stuff done. And I'm not saying don't vote for her. What I am saying is the same people who told you could only vote for Hillary Clinton because she has all the experience are now behind someone who has no experience lawmaking at all. It's just basically her experience as being a prosecutor, which might line you up maybe to be, I guess, attorney general, but it's a very different skill set than president. Yeah. And so, it shows you how in politics, people often make their conclusion and then they form their arguments around that conclusion. These people are for Harris for some reason, but they don't really care that much about experience. And I'm sure whatever arguments they use against Bernie Sanders or whoever this time are also going to be the same way. They'll drop those arguments the second another argument is more appealing to them at the moment. So.
Right. Well said. So we have a couple of questions on the board. If you haven't gotten your question out there, if you've got a burning question, whether you've commented or not, we have had dozens and dozens of people watching over the course of this live event. By the way, we only have 5 likes. And we have many orders of magnitude more viewers. So if you haven't liked this video, go ahead and click that thumbs up button. It helps get the word out about the show and the live feed. We're doing this every Thursday night at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And we're just kind of building this audience, and we hope that it grows. I hope this time slot works for everybody. Thursday night is a little bit of a wild card. I don't know. Is it too close to the weekend? Are people going out to the bar? Are they checking out and playing video games? I'm not sure, but we'll see. For now, Thursday at 8 p.m. it is. But click that like button. Subscribe to the channel. That way you'll get notifications when we go live in the future. And all that good stuff. Tell your friends. Share the link on your social media pages. And anyway, enough of that plug. I'm going to put the same question to you, Zed, that I put to our mutual friend and colleague, Daniel Marins, last week. Mm-hmm. Let's do some prognostication. Let's do the fun shit. You're not a journalist right now. You're focused on a big picture societal and ethical and moral and political questions. But let's put on that prognostication hat. It's March Madness on Dead Pundit Society already. Give us your bracket. Who do you think's going to make it to the final leg of this Democratic Party primary? Will it be 2 people? Will it be 3? Who will drop out first? And who will hang on until the bitter end.
I mean, in a world that goes from George W. Bush being president to Barack Hussein Obama being president to Donald Trump being president, it's so unpredictable that I don't necessarily love to make prognostications, but I think I have to play. I have to play along because that's the game.
You got to play the game.
Uh,
I'm giving you a way out here. This is just for
yeah,
funsies, just for shits and giggles.
I see potentially three people kind of becoming the go-to people, the ones who are going to fight it out till the end. I think if Biden gets in, he will be one of those people.
You don't
'Cause I
think he'll
he
get
can
Me
keep it.
Too? Because I think his record not only in the the various affairs with his support for busing and the kind of the programs that are now just completely anathema to mainstream Democratic Party sentiments, but I think he's going to get Me Too. Do you think he'll make it past the?
I think
Yeah.
he gets like grandfathered into all that stuff almost because it's like
If Garrison Keillor doesn't get grandfathered in, do you think Biden gets
somehow
grandfathered in?
Joe Biden does, because we've
Really?
all seen videos of Joe Biden like creeping on women, and like it's just like, oh, Joe Biden, like it's not necessarily the way I would respond, but in some ways so many especially older Democrats who've grown up with Joe Biden, who like him, who love the imagery of him as vice president with Barack Obama. I think these people, they just kind of let it pass. And I think a lot of the people who would hold that stuff against him are probably, they're going to vote for the other candidates regardless.
Yeah.
I could be wrong. That's why I say politics is so unpredictable. You never know. I do think Biden will be one of the people. I think Sanders will probably be one of the top three. And then I think a third person will probably be there. It'll likely be Harris or maybe Beto if Beto runs, because Beto does have a constituency and he does have an appeal.
Do you think that Beto's going to declare? Because I think people right now feel
Right.
like he's probably missed his window. Do you think there's still room for him to jump in?
I think there is, because he developed a massive fundraising list and the media loves him. Like, the media loves him more than potentially they love any candidate. Like, it's hard to find a negative or critical story of him other than like the one I wrote for Current Affairs, and David Sirota wrote one. And like, those of us kind of on the alternative media side have written stuff, but mainstream media is in love with him the same way they were in love with Obama. And that has got to help him if he decides to run.
Yeah.
He also, one of his key staff is Becky Bond, who defected from the Sanders camp. She actually defected before Beto even ran for Senate. I think she has some kind of falling out with them. But basically, she built him a fundraising juggernaut machine. He has a massive list. So if he wants to run for president, I feel like he could build a machine. And I think that's part of why he's sitting around and doing his little road trip, because he's not like Warren or Harris, where people don't know him very well, and he doesn't have a very large list necessarily. He can afford to wait a little bit, although he can't wait too long, because somebody like Biden could also crowd him out, because it is somewhat similar appeal.
So tell me though, I mean, I hear you. I don't disagree with anything that you're saying, but in terms of the whole like March, in the spirit of the March Madness kind of bracket that we're trying to sort of line up here, and I believe me, there will be a bracket on DPS Radio at some point. I want you to get in on that, but just not for the kind of like funsies Vox crowd, but in terms of like, my question is like, who do you and I need to take out next? Because I love that shit. Like, let's go hard in the paint and figure out who stands in the way of our boy Bernie, and let's take him down. Because I mean, too many of these people are getting a free pass. I mean, hell, it wasn't until a month ago, even, I would say, that some really great socialists that I know personally were like, you're being too hard on Beto. You're going too hard on Beto. And after hearing our excoriations in your writing and a number of other people, Megan Day had a piece over at Jacobin. A number of other DPS guests have written against him. And all of a sudden, the tide changes, and he no longer has any steam coming from the progressive sector. So I think we have a really important role to play. I don't want to overstate the left and progressive reach in the American media scene. But here's my question. Let's say Beto announces tomorrow. He won't, but let's say he does. What does he have over Kirsten Gillibrand and Kamala Harris right now as we stand?
I think Beto, it's like the John Kennedy thing. Like, some of the people I know who really love Beto are like maybe 2 generations or 1 generation older than I am. I think they want to see someone who projects an image of being a younger, more positive, kind of more optimistic, progressive type America. And I've even talked to people who think he's Mexican. Like the Beto thing worked on them. Like this guy is like an Irish American, but he shortened his name from Robert to Beto, and there are people who think he's like Mexican. Like it actually kind of worked on them. Like
Oh God, I don't want to
out
believe
of
that's
any,
true, but you're
if
probably
you
right.
think if if you think about politics as like a branding exercise and they're selling products, like Beto actually, he has that product.
Yeah,
And honestly, he's just a much more like relatable, nicer guy than most of the other candidates. Like I've talked to him before. Like
yeah.
he knows how to relate to people. He knows how to talk to people. All the like superficial personality things that you need in politics, he kind of has those things. If he was actually Mexican, that might even help him a little bit more. Although he's not actually Mexican, he just shortened his name enough to trick people into thinking he is. Just like Ted Cruz became Ted Cruz instead of Rafael Cruz,
Should he go?
which
Should he
was the
go
funniest
Elizabeth
thing.
Warren and try the 23andMe to see if maybe he can pull out some
Oh
ancestry there?
Lord. I think that when I was saying that Warren is a political neophyte, I mean, that's part of it. Like she tried to solve a highly emotional issue with like an empirical, like, look, I have the DNA test. Now you have to agree with my thesis. Like it's something like you can imagine a Harvard professor doing. No offense to Harvard professors because they have great academics over there. But yeah, like she's just too empirical. Like Beto would not do something like that. Like Beto knows jump on the skateboard and go in
Do a
front of the
kickflip for the
Whataburger.
kids. Yeah.
Yeah, like nobody will criticize you for that. That's just fun. And like there's nobody else in the race who I think just knows how to have fun like that. And like that actually, as stupid as it is, that is something that gets you points in politics. Like it kind of does get him points in
But
politics.
here's the
And I
question:
don't
Will
think
Beto take
yeah, go
any
ahead.
steam away from Bernie? Is that really what I care about? Because if Beto's competing for the same segment of the electorate as say Kamala and Kirsten and maybe Booker. Maybe Warren. I think Warren will have to drop out pretty early. She's going to be polling so poorly, I think, going into the first couple of months. Do you think that Beto's audience, if should he declare, will take any steam away from Gramps?
I don't think so. I think that he actually appeals a little bit more to older people because I think
Huh.
older people like seeing that kind of Kennedy-esque. This is a young guy. We need to turn the page on this old people in politics. Whereas like the Sanders base of young people, it's just they're really actually very policy focused, like remarkably policy focused
Yeah,
for like a
that's
political
true.
constituency in a presidential race. And they've seen Bernie out on the scene for decades. They all have seen videos of him, memes of him, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that I actually don't see him doing a massive vote overlap with Sanders, although Sanders probably does need to expand his reach with older voters a little bit. That was really what kept him from winning Iowa last time. Was that although being a race with like 8 or 10 people, it might not matter very much. Maybe if he just keeps his base of young people, he can pull it off. I think in terms of threats to Sanders, probably Biden, just with respect to the fact that Biden is just a very likable right now, anyway, kind of well-known person. Um, he's not as cringy as somebody like Hillary. Uh, and the polls right now show, like in Iowa, like if you look at first and second choices, like apparently Biden's people's second choice is Bernie Sanders. So they're winnable. It's winnable to take people away from Biden. But Biden, I think, I what I imagine what's happening with Biden is the same thing that was happening with Hillary if you looked at her polls in like 2015, which is that she was just kind of in the background, well-known person, kind of associated with Barack Obama, who Democrats liked. So they get kind of a good pass in the polling. Like there haven't really been like a series of really negative campaign events with Biden, negative stories, critical oppo thrown out there. I think maybe once that happens, maybe Biden will be a lot softer. Uh, but right now, obviously, if he does get into the race, he would be the main opponent for Sanders.
Hmm.
And, I think the fact that all the Clinton people are consolidating behind Harris means that I think they're going to try to make her into like a front runner, even though she really isn't a front runner if you look at the polling as it stands right now. But I think they're going to keep promoting her. Like, I think I wrote a blog post about this on 2020 Watch, which is that there were a number of websites that called her a front runner when she was polling at like fifth or sixth, which is just like that's not even the definition. Like you can't go past like the top three at least and call somebody a front runner.
Yeah, I
And
mean, she's
then
actually
CNN
second to
gave her
last. Like definitionally, she's
C,
second to last. That's not a front runner.
CNN gave her a like full town hall. They didn't give that to Warren. They didn't give that to Tulsi Gabbard. They gave her a full town hall like right as she got out the door. And actually, her polling has improved since all that. Like that's the kind of the sad thing about politics is if you put a fake narrative out there, it kind of starts to become real over
It
time
does.
because you
It
keep
really
pushing it out
does.
there. So her polling has actually improved, where she's probably, I don't know, third or fourth in some states. She's still not beating Sanders or Biden, but she is actually improving because the media is pushing her so hard. So if she kind of becomes the media du jour candidate, like the Democratic Trump, they keep just putting in the media constantly, uncritically, perhaps she could end up being also a threat. I mean, one of the issues with her is her record is so thin on a lot of the legislative issues. Like, who can say where Kamala Harris is on climate, on banks, on healthcare? Yeah. She can say whatever she wants, because there's nothing we can go back and look and say, well, are you really that? Because her record is all just prosecuting people. And actually, I should break the news that I'm starting a podcast, and I've recorded a couple episodes.
Yeah, let's talk about your podcast here. People should check out 2020watch.org. That'll be in the show notes. But you've got a podcast in the make. Let's hear about that. What do you got going?
Yeah, so basically my podcast, I'm producing it with a good friend of mine. And basically, I don't want to give too much away because we'll scoop ourselves. Basically, it's about political tribes, trying to bring together people in different tribes to kind of hash the issues out. But not in like the way you see on NPR, where it's like view from nowhere. Nobody really cares about the issue. We're all just like talking about it. But actually like have heated debates, but actually like respect each other as people and actually get at a lot of the truth you don't get at if you just don't like talking to people on the other side. And the reason I bring it up right now is that actually I had a very, very smart guest. I probably shouldn't say who it is because I don't want to scoop ourselves again. But someone who follows politics very closely, and they were actually it's an interesting question to see how the Democratic Party and also Democratic-leaning independents process Kamala Harris's prosecutorial record. Because in the past, politicians on the Democratic side have often been able to get away with being tough on crime, including among like African-American constituencies, and it's particularly people who are themselves African-American or in Harris's case biracial. I think that it's really, really interesting to see me whether she'll pay a political price for being tough on crime. Because generally Democrats have not paid a price for that. They can get away with doing it. In fact, you can get away with it more if you're a Democrat than if you're a Republican. The same way, Democrats can more easily cut Social Security than Republicans can. Or Republicans can reform criminal justice arguably easier than Democrats can. Like, for instance, Trump is the one who got the First Step Act across the line there, and Obama wasn't able to get the consensus to be able to do it. So yeah, that is one of the topics we discuss on our new podcast, which hopefully we'll be launching within the next week. I'm not exactly sure what the schedule is, but just keep an eye out for that.
Well, I've got an announcement here on DPS. We're actually going to be running a series where we're talking about the polarization. I'm just kidding. No, that's fantastic, man. I mean, you guys. I've been a fan of your work for a long time. And I'm really, really pumped to see that you can do that. And maybe, we should keep this collaboration going. Really excited that you're going to have a much broader audience and try to transcend some of these ridiculous divides in a real principled direction. But we've got some questions on the table. And friend of the show reached out to me at FentPop. One of the best Twitter accounts out there, by the way. If you guys aren't following at FentPop, you're missing some of the most real biting, cutting edge, critical and political cultural commentary out there in the Twitter sphere. So follow at FentPop. But he reminded me via DM, Zed, we have not talked about John Lewis v. Julian Bond, circa, I think that was like 1978? Can we unpack that in the next 4 minutes, and then we'll get to a couple more questions before we wrap. What was the legacy there?
That was so both Julian Bond and John Lewis, civil rights veterans, brothers in arms who faced off with slings and arrows to get civil and human rights in the American South. I'm deeply grateful to both of them. Since that, they have had divergent political careers.
Yeah.
And they actually both ran for Congress, I believe in the late 80s was their race to represent that district in Atlanta,
so
which
I'm a little
I think
early.
Is the fifth.
It was the mid to late 80s.
Fifth. Right. I think it was the late 80s, and it was the 5th congressional district, I believe.
Was it not the governor's race? I'm sorry, the mayoral race for Atlanta.
Bond did run for mayor. I think he was actually the mayor for a while. But yes. the Lewis Bond race though where they were up against each other was for Congress.
Okay.
It was for the 5th Congressional. I just pulled it up. It's 1986 was the.
I've been recounting
year
this
that they ran.
incorrectly then. So because again, I looked into this. There's very little in writing about this, which is astonishing because this is a real critical kind of a point of divergence. That if you're an historian or a real kind of political commentator, you would want to look at this moment to see how there was a fracture in the political strategic orientations, ideological orientations of, say, various elements of the black electorate inside the Democratic Party in this moment. And they've been divergent ever since. And those fractures are becoming much more extreme over the past couple of years. But tell us this story.
Yeah, so basically they both ran for this 5th congressional seat. It's a overwhelmingly Democratic district. You win the Democratic primary, you're basically the dude who's the dude or the woman who's the member of Congress. And so they came from, although they were both African American, they're both civil rights veterans, they kind of came from different bases. So John Lewis was kind of the media darling. I think a lot of the sort of the intellectual class, maybe, is one way to think about it, were people who were Lewis folks. And on the other side, you had Julian Bond, who I think was a state senator at the time, and he sort of courted a different sort of segment of the electorate, even though they were both sort of black liberals in a sense. Bond, I think, relied more on the sort of the African American vote. Lewis relied more sort of on the white liberal establishment and the sort of the neighborhood organizations there. And Lewis played pretty dirty. Like, we always think of Lewis, like, I remember when Lewis came out against Bernie Sanders, and this is really funny. If you read the Podesta emails, Podesta was already drafting an email saying, lay off John Lewis. Like, it was pretty clearly like, this is the thing. Like, people play these are professionals, okay? They don't just, like, come out and attack. Like, John Lewis obviously planned this with the Clinton campaign. And people were saying, I think a lot of the Bernie people also felt like, okay, yeah, John Lewis can say whatever he wants about Bernie. He's John Lewis. But John Lewis can be a pretty cunning political operator. John Lewis basically started making allegations about Bond, drug use, about being kind of a shady figure, not someone you can trust. And I believe when the vote actually went through, I remember reading this, but I don't know specifically what John Lewis said, but I think John Lewis even kind of alluded to the fact that, like, he won certain votes over Bond, like for instance, the Jewish vote, because John Lewis was very close to AIPAC and the pro-Israel camp. Mm-hmm. And interestingly, John Lewis never supports anything pro-Palestinian in Congress. But the member of Congress right next door in the district next door, Hank Johnson, supports almost everything that's pro-Palestinian. He goes to events, he signs on to resolutions, he does, J Street type stuff, Jewish Voice for Peace type stuff. John Lewis never does any of it. So John Lewis basically mobilized a class of people who were against the black left to defeat Julian Bond in that race. And I believe Julian Bond also has had a radical history. I believe when he first entered the state legislature, like, they wouldn't seat him because he was opposed to the Vietnam War or something like that.
Yeah. Well, Adolph Reed Jr. Adolph Reed Jr. explains that, at least in his accounting of this, which I have no reason to doubt because he was there in Georgia, I believe, at the time, or at least affiliated with the campaign where he stood in North Carolina, is that Julian Bond was just very far and away the Social Democratic candidate in that race. Mm-hmm. He was the one who was he had the support of labor. He had the support of the black community, the traditional kind of materialist kind of civil rights movement. And this was a moment where John Lewis was ready to throw down the gauntlet and really go after Bond in a really dirty way that you've just sort of laid out here. And I think what's interesting is you see John Lewis emerging victorious from that race. And what is deemed to be the kind of, he still to this day carries the mantle of the civil rights movement in a way that is perhaps not entirely deserved. Now, he did get the crap beat out of him on a bridge in Alabama, and he deserves all of the credit in the world for his very brave stance against horrendous white supremacy in the 1960s. But the trajectories ever since have been far more mixed. It's an interesting story.
Yeah, I mean, the trajectories are very interesting for, I think, everyone in the civil rights movement. Kind of seeing where they started out, where they ended up. I remember Andrew Young came to University of Georgia, where I went to school once, and he recounted a lot of his civil rights history. It was really interesting. I always remember he said that he loved the FBI because they never took notes in the civil rights movement, but the FBI recorded everything. So, he has a good sense of humor too. But I also know that Andy Young, that Young, although Young has done very good things, including as UN ambassador, he met with the Palestinians, a huge taboo. He had to resign. He's done a lot of great things. I also remember that Andy Young later became a spokesperson for Walmart, right? And he helped defend them against criticism from minority communities. And he only had to resign from that position. I remember when he said something racist against Asians or Arabs or something.
Yeah,
He's like,
that was weird.
So people have trajectories in their lives. Everybody does. It's almost kind of natural or expected. It's more common than not to have a trajectory where you don't necessarily keep the faith to where you started from the beginning.
Well, Zed, I'm a Marxist.
Hard for me to think of somebody like that.
I'm a Marxist, so I'm really looking forward to this neocon turn that I get to make in like my early 60s. Because that's when you're nearing retirement and you're looking for a real you're looking for a payday. Didn't
Bill Kristol tweet something in favor of socialism recently or something? So maybe there's a third. If you get old enough as a neocon, you turn back into a Marxist. I don't know if that's how it works.
Maybe if you hit your 90s, you make a U-turn. Maybe that's the real horseshoe theory, right? You think about some of these Trotskyists in the 1930s and 40s who turned into neocons in the 60s. I don't know. Maybe if they lived long enough, would they have become socialists again? I don't know. That's an interesting question. We've got about 10 minutes before we lose the feed. Let's burn through these two cutting questions before we leave here. And before we do that, again, we've got some more likes and subscribes here, but be sure that you click that thumbs up button if you are a live listener. We really would appreciate that. We want to continue building this stream. It is exceedingly difficult to build a live audience. People have things to do. I don't know if you guys heard about this or not, but there's this thing out there called neoliberalism, which means that people work more and more and have way less free time than they ever used to have before. It's apparently overtaking society like gangbusters, but we're up against some really powerful forces for people's free time, and we appreciate that you take the time out to listen. So go ahead and hit that thumbs up button if you haven't had the chance to do so. And let's get to these final questions. June Park asks, really great question, important one, I think, particularly in the wake of the absurdity, the bloodthirsty nature of the ruling class over Venezuela. I mean, the Wall Street Journal has just been, they've been foaming at the mouth over the Venezuelan situation. And I'm ready to take a nuanced perspective. I think the Maduro administration has grossly, they've just poorly managed the economy in a variety of ways. These are technical failures. Not so much political or class failures, technical failures. But despite that, these technical failures that have led to massive inflation and so on and so forth, there's no doubt that there is a class and imperialist oriented, offensive in Venezuela. And Tulsi Gabbard is one of the few people in the halls of power who are willing to stand up against this. What do you make of Tulsi Gabbard? Does she have a chance in this crowded field of candidates?
On paper, I think she's a skilled politician in many ways. So on paper, she would have a chance, but she does have a lot of strange baggage.
She does.
She was basically involved with a cult when she was younger, and she had very reactionary politics at one point. She doesn't really anymore, but she did at one point. And all that baggage, it's going to be very difficult for her. Also, I think Bernie folks would feel like she's kind of threatening their lane a little bit. If they don't have ranked choice voting in the Democratic race, which they should, it would take care of a big part of this problem. But so I honestly, it's kind of hard for me to see her kind of get traction, although she has made some smart moves in the presidential race. Her launch video was excellent. I thought it was done really well.
Yeah. I mean, I think, Tulsi Gabbard in 2019, I think is fantastic. My question is, what does she bring to the table that Bernie doesn't? Maybe she sticks her neck out more in the anti-interventionist realm. She was leading the way in the anti-interventionist realm in Syria. She's pushing back against this quote, Shia crescent, this kind of Saudi American Israeli regional imperialist venture that is only accelerated under the Trump administration. And she is one of the lone voices in Congress who've persistently and consistently pushed back against that. But my question would be, given Bernie's foreign policy speech at Johns Hopkins just several months ago, I'm not sure what she brings to the table that Bernie Sanders hasn't already signed on to. So in my view, oh my God, Tulsi's a veteran. She would make a fantastic Secretary of Defense, wouldn't she? But then again, she really loves drones. So I don't know. What do you think, Zed? Where does she sit?
It's hard to say. I will say some of the recent articles about her that were critical kind of went overboard. Like, she was doing some stuff with Hindu nationalists a few years ago, like maybe 3 or 4, 5 years ago. She was kind of connected to American Hindu nationalists. Now she just kind of chills out with more neutral Hindu Americans. But some of these articles, like, they just took names of a bunch of Hindu donors and were like, okay, this proves that she's still a Hindu nationalist. Or they talked about the Hindu American Foundation, which is a very, like, bipartisan type thing. It's not like right-wing organization. So I will just say that, like, some of the recent criticism of her, I think, has been really overwrought. Because I wrote a very critical article about her a few years ago for Alternate, looking into some of the Hindu nationalist ties. But I think she's backed off most of that since then. Yeah. That isn't to say you shouldn't consider that in terms of the gamut of her politics. But it is to say that at least these recent articles, it would be really good if they were more nuanced. I think they're kind of smearing a lot of ordinary, like, Hindu Americans in the attempt to kind of make the case, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, that's probably true. Her father obviously, ran a gay conversion therapy nonprofit, and she worked for that organization in her college years, I believe, and she has since renounced that. But there's no question that in terms of optics, that's going to haunt her. If we're to hold Elizabeth Warren accountable for the fact that she's registered herself for the Texas Bar Association as a Native American, I think that we should at least acknowledge that Tulsi's going to be in trouble for some of her past associations, for better or for worse. Whether or not that's just, I don't know. We can remain agnostic on that question, but there's no question she's going to have to account for that at some point. I'd love to see her secretary. What about Secretary of State Tulsi Gabbard in a Bernie Sanders administration?
If I was like a President Bernie, I'd probably pick Rand Paul. And I'd put him in, and then I'd say, look how bipartisan I am. And then, I guess Kentucky has to hold another Senate election. That's unfortunate, but we got Rand Paul as Secretary of State. That's probably the move I would pull. I feel like it would be savvy. But I feel like she is kind of an ally of Sanders in a way. He'd probably bring her into an administration in some role.
Yeah.
So
I've already asked you a very difficult question. This will be the last question on the board unless something else comes up that is just absolutely really great. But I've already asked you a very difficult question. Who do you think is going to make it to the final? Actually, you know what? Damn it, Zed, you didn't answer that question. You dodged the question, my friend.
I sort of did.
You dodged the question. Who is it? Give me names. Name some names. We're in the Cold War 2.0. I want names. Who do you think is going to make it to the final four, the final 3-2 of the primary?
Biden, Sanders, Harris, and Beto will be the final four.
That's ballsy because two of the four haven't even declared yet, and it's questionable as to whether or not they will.
Right.
Ooh, I like it. I like it for the ballsiness, but mine is, maybe more conventional in terms of the people I'm considering have all declared. Well, Bernie hasn't, but we think that's inevitable. But I've got Bernie holding out at that 1 seed. Mm-hmm. I think that Kamala, because of the self-fulfilling prophecy that you talked about, and we're already seeing, and it's only a matter of time when people start endorsing. When Hillary endorses Kamala, she's boom projected into that number 2 slot immediately. I think Booker can't stand up to Kamala. I think Gillibrand can for a time, and Daniel Marin's convinced me of this. He's been on the campaign trail with Kirsten Gillibrand for some time, flying around the country on her airplane, for God's sakes. And I think he's probably right about that. That Gillibrand has a relatively unique niche. However, should the calf cramper in chief, Beto O'Rourke, declare, that could take some steam out of Gillibrand's sails. So assuming Beto doesn't declare, I think it's going to be Bernie and Kamala, and I think Gillibrand is going to hang on way longer than she should. That's my take. I don't think Biden will declare. I think Amy Therese was correct last week when she mentioned that Biden is just having too much fun and making way too much money on the speaker circuit to muddy his name. What do you make of that bracket before we move on to the final question?
That's a fair bracket, the one that you just laid out. It's entirely possible. I'm not 100% sure that Biden will get in either, although it kind of looks to me like he's seriously looking at it, though. So.
Ed, the commenter responded, Booker stood up to a drug dealer. That's true. I mean, if he can stand up to T-Bone, he can surely face down Kamala Harris. That's a good point.
He's a really good speaker, but he chokes a lot when he he tries to own somebody at a hearing, and he just owns himself a lot. So
yeah, I mean, and he's still just such a shyster for the likes of charter schools and finance. Yeah, I can't imagine, given the kind of progressive anti-elite temperament of American politics right now, that he'll really be able to hold up much longer. I mean, this is a guy who's defending Bain Capital a couple of years ago. These hostile takeovers wherein they buy out corporations, they fire thousands of workers. You saw that at GM earlier this year, Ford. I mean, other types of plants are firing people and sort of reorganizing production and then reopening and selling off these companies for a song. And Booker's going to bat for these types. I don't know if in this economy that can really launch. I think there'll be a failure to launch there, but we'll see. Anyway, this is all fun and games. Final question. In a sense, that was the easy question. Here's the hard question. Who is the least desirable candidate for 2020, and why?
Like I said, I'm not trying to tell anyone how to vote, et cetera, et cetera. But, the reality is Kirsten Gillibrand, at least if you're like us, you spend a lot of time looking at politics online, she's trying so hard to be one of the Sean McElwee types. She's trying so hard, she goes to his happy hour and stuff and she's actually one of the easiest politicians to understand in this entire race, because she always does what's in her short-term political interest. If it's for her short-term political interest to be the NRA A grade person, fine. If it's to be a totally anti-gun person, fine. If it's to do this, if it's to do that. And, someone like Sean has made the argument that, opportunists are great. We want to be ruled by Claire Underwood. Okay, no, we don't want to be ruled by Frank and Claire Underwood, because guess what? Kirsten Gillibrand is not going to get in office in 2021 and say, let me look at Sean's tweets and see, I'll do exactly what he'll say because I'm an opportunist. An opportunist in 2021 is going to look at $1 billion of health insurance industry and doctors and pharma, all of this money they're lining up, and say, well, I better respect that, because that's really not a good opportunity for me to fight all these people. It's not going to look at Benjamin Netanyahu and say, I'm going to risk political capital fighting with him for a just solution for Israel and the Palestinians. It's not, opportunists are not good. Maybe they're part of the system. We have to deal with them. I think Jeremy Corbyn in the UK has had to deal with opportunists, figure out how to get people like Sadiq Khan on his side. Fine. But they're not ideal. And they're really not the people you want in the leadership, because then they'll always sell you out when it's time for another short-term great opportunity for them. So I think out of any politician standing now, she probably has the least actual philosophy and the most opportunistic kind of bent to her personality. And that's that's really not what you want in your leadership. That's the total opposite of what we want. I would put Howard Schultz in front of Kirsten Gillibrand, honestly.
Well, that's tough. You think his affiliations, his loyalties are more clear than Gillibrand? Because Gillibrand, as Daniel Marins pointed out last week, she's real popular with the wine moms. She talks the talk.
I mean, she taught, she called herself a young mom during her lunch. And I was like, okay, what does that mean? Okay, one, she's not young. She's in her 50s. Second, her kid is like 16 years old. So she didn't mean young as in I haven't been a mom for long.
Yeah.
It's like, what are you
really
trying to say
the
here?
Association.
I mean, I don't care. I don't care, man, woman, young, old. None of that matters to me for the presidency. But when you do frame yourself around a certain way and then you say that, then you're opening yourself up for like, are you really? Like, I don't know.
Well, this has been a lot of fun. I hate to end this, but we're at the 2-hour mark. We're going to lose the feed going forward if we continue. But I've really, really thoroughly enjoyed this. Zaid Jilani, people should check out, again, 2020watch.org. You've got posts going up there related to this Democratic Party primary charade that we're going to have to endure for the next 2 years. And people should check that out. You've got a podcast coming out in a matter of days or weeks. Do you have a name for that so far?
I don't think I should say the name because I think that would also be scooping us. But I'll put it out on. We'll put it out on social media, and we'll definitely get it out.
The message discipline here. I can learn from this.
You can tell I've been involved in politics for way too long that I'm being this secretive. But
yeah, loose lips sink ships.
We'll get it up. Well, I think it'll be up probably by the middle of the month, the first episode, and then we'll have the second one out, and we'll keep going. So I hope all of you enjoy it.
Yeah, I mean, if I go to sleep and have a dream about something different I'm going to do on the podcast, I wake up and think that it actually happened, I'll announce it on the podcast. Like that's the message discipline that I have over here on DPS. It's pathetic. These loose lips rather have probably sunk a lot of ships. But anyway, I respect the hustle. Zaid Jilani, thanks so much for joining us on DPS. You are welcome to come. I will say what Tucker Carlson said to you in signing off. You are welcome, sir, to come back on DPS anytime because I have thoroughly enjoyed this. Let's do this again real soon.
Yeah, thank you, Adam. I'm proudly bipartisan these days, I guess.
That's right. I think it's great that real principled progressives and lefties have the confidence to face down almost anyone and debate them if the opportunity arises. So let's keep this going. Zaid Jilani, everybody, thank you so much for listening along. The comments and the questions were fantastic. We'll see you next week on Thursday at 8 p.m. Same time, same place. We are out. Thanks so much for joining.
Oh, this you crazy mother.